Hi, Jay Andrews here with Laguna Tools. Today we're going to have a look at one of our most popular selling table saws. This is the Fusion F1 Table Saw. The Fusion F1 Table Saw will arrive to you on a shipping carrier. It'll be in a box just like this. The first thing that you want to do when taking delivery of your saw is to take a quick walk around the box. And if you notice any damage, like this box has got a little bit of damage right here, note it on the shipping carrier receipt. That way, if there's any questions later on, we can refer back to that. Secondly, when you open the box up and start taking the machine and the components out of it, view those parts, and if there's any damage to those parts, notify us within 48 hours so that we can file a claim with the shipping carrier for you. Let's get it out of the box first. First thing you want to grab is the owner's manual. Take a few moments to read through here before doing the assembly of the machine. If you want to get the most current version, it's always available on our website at lagunatools.com. Just click over to the Fusion F1 page. Now that the top styrofoam is removed, let's take out the parts from the bottom compartment. Now that I've got all the parts out, I've left the heaviest piece in the box. And this is the heaviest piece, so I want to make sure that I cut the box off from around the saw. Now this remaining part is very, very heavy. If you're going to lift this up, do so with the help of another individual. If you're going to try to do this by yourself, make sure that you're able-bodied and just tip it up, pull the styrofoam away and lay it back down. Assembling the base is pretty straightforward. There are 4 components to the base. There's 2 end panels and the front and back. And these are assembled by standing the panels up and bolting those together. If you're going to install the optional mobility kit, now is the time to do it. It'll go right directly into the 4 holes on one of the end panels. You're going to locate the bag of hardware that has the rubber feet in it and the nuts and bolts to assemble the base. You want to grab a 13mm wrench to complete this assembly. As you assemble these flat panels to the end panels, make sure that the cutout section of it is toward the base of the panel, so it'll go on just like that. Okay, that's the last of 8 bolts to assemble the base. The next step is going to be to install the leveling feet that go on the bottom. You're going to take a nut and insert it on to the post of each of the leveling feet. This is a jam nut that will allow you to set the machine level and to lock it down with the nut. Just go ahead and put those all the way on and to thread the feet into the bottom. Okay, I've got all the feet installed. I've got them tightened down. If you need to make any adjustments, you can do that later. There's also quite a bit of bolt on each of these leveling feet, so you can increase or decrease the height of the saw to match other machines in your shop if you like. Now that the base is assembled, You're going to locate this panel. This is part number 141 in the back of the manual, and this is the base of the upper cabinet. Grab this first before you install the base onto the saw. Just set the plate on the bottom of the machine. You'll see the square carriage bolt holes, and you're going to find 4 little small holes on the end panels. These go in with a Phillips head screw that's in your hardware bag. I like to start those first and then tighten them down once I have them all positioned. This panel serves as a bottom for the upper cabinet. It improves dust collection and keeps the sawdust from going down onto the floor beside your machine. Make sure you install this before installing the base. Now take the base and set it up onto the upper cabinet. Line up those carriage bolt holes. And then finally drop in the 8 carriage bolts in through the top and install the nuts on the bottom side. Now that I have the 8 carriage bolts installed, I'm going to install the 8 nuts onto the bottom. You'll reach in through the cover on the side of the saw, locate each of these, and then thread the nut on and tighten them down with a 13mm wrench. Okay, now that I've got those 8 bolts installed and tightened down, I'm ready to stand the saw up. And again, if you've got the mobility kit, the optional mobility kit, go ahead and bolt it on right now. And again, it'll go into the 4 holes that are on one side of the machine. You can do it from either side. Let's go ahead and stand up the saw. Get a friend to help you out because this gets heavy now. The next step is to grab the motor cover. This will be the cover that goes on the side of the machine. And you'll want to grab 2 of the fence hangers and the associated hardware. And finally, a Phillips head screwdriver and a couple of 13mm wrenches. The first step will be to install these hangers, these are for the fence, onto the side of the motor cover. We'll use the bolts supplied and we'll put the nuts on the inside. These are a nylock nut, so you'll tighten those down and these will be on there and they won't rattle loose. As you tighten these down, make sure that these hangers are down toward the beveled side of the motor cover. Now that the hangers are pre-installed onto the motor cover, grab your Phillips head screwdriver and remove the 4 Phillips head screws that are on the side of the machine, and this is where that motor cover will go. Before you install the cover, make sure you remove any desiccant bags that might be inside the saw cabinet. Now before we install the wings, it's time to remove the plastic and clean off the packing grease off of the cast iron tabletop. You want to get the plastic out of the way, and I find that WD-40 works really good to clean this. Make sure you clean the grooves and all of the tabletop surface before bolting anything on. I find that WD-40 works really great for cutting the packing grease that's on top of the table. Make sure you give it a liberal coat, start wiping down the surface, and then finally finish it off using a screwdriver and a rag to get into these cutouts on the table, the miter slots. They could be sharp, and so you want to use a screwdriver to push the rag through. Once you have that wiped off, come back with a nice dry rag just to clean off any residual oil. Now that the cabinet base is all prepared and the saw is ready to go, it's time to install the wings that go on the side of the saw. And there are 4 bolt holes that are threaded on either side of the cast iron tabletop. Grab the stamped steel wings and bolt these on using the hex-headed screws and a 6mm Allen wrench to install those. These tables are ambidextrous, meaning that they have holes on both sides, and so this could go on either side of the saw. Preload one of the bolts, start it, and start on the front or the back. Tighten that down finger tight and then do the opposite end, and then you can install the middle ones without having to hold it in position. I like to leave these finger tight as I'm installing these so I can adjust the table for level once it's installed. Okay, I've got the table tightened down. This left side table goes right on, and it goes pretty easy, especially if you have a longer handle Allen wrench. What I really find is easiest is something that's not in the manual though, and this is a quick tip for you, is if you leave that motor cover off and then install the left wing, you can put the motor cover on a lot easier with the wing on than you can with the wing when the motor cover is already installed. So do the wing first, then put the motor cover on. It's a little alteration from the manual, but it'll be a lot easier on you. Now repeat the process on the other side. Now that the wings are bolted to the tabletop, double check to make sure that they're flush, because this is the last chance you have to make sure that the adjustments are done correctly before bolting the fence on. And don't worry that the outside edges flex a little bit, because the fence is going to lock them in. You're going to have a fence on the front and a fence on the back that bolts these in securely. Get your hardware laid out. You're going to need a 6mm Allen wrench. You're going to need a 13mm closed-in wrench. On the back fence, it's going to use the 6mm Allen-headed bolts. And on the front fence, it's going to use the square-headed bolts, and these are going to slide into the T-slot that's on the back side of the fence. Let's go ahead and get our bolts started on the front, and then we'll slide the front fence rail onto the square-headed bolts. Starting at the front of the saw, take the square-headed bolts, leave the square side out, reach around, slide a washer onto the bolt, and then a nut, and leave these finger tight. You want to go through and put these where they've got quite a bit of slack in the front, because you're going to slide the fence on there. So I'll just start the nut. I'll leave that out about 1/4 inch or so, and repeat the process for the rest of the bolts. Now I'm ready to install the front fence rail. It comes in 2 sections. I'm going to do the long side first, slide it over the bolts. And you'll see that there's a mark here on the front. This mark is going to line up with the blade. Now let's grab the short section of the front fence and slide it over the square bolts on the front before tightening everything down. And you'll see that there are location pins on the short section of the fence that intersect with holes on the long section. Line those up and then slide the 2 halves together before tightening everything down. Before I tighten down the front rail, I like to install the rear rail also. You'll take the Allen head screws and you're going to insert those. They've got a lock wash on them. Insert them right through the hole. I like to start one, typically second one over, so I've got a little bit of balance. And you're going to have about 11 inches hanging off of the side of the saw. Line this up, insert it in the hole. Finally, insert a washer and then one of the nuts. And again, finger tight on this until you have everything adjusted. Grab a second one. Insert it through the wing with the washer and nut. Now I can go back and insert the bolt on the far end and then the short extension. Now that both the front and rear fence rails are on the saw, take a few moments to level these off, adjust them to where they're flat together, and then finally tighten them down with a wrench and the Allen wrench. Before I tighten the fence rails down, I like to raise the blade and gauge the center line. And so it's time to install the crank handles. There's one for the tilt, and then there's another one for the blade height. They look the same, but they're slightly different. You'll see that this one has sort of a squared off hole. It's a large diameter hole. And then this one has got a small hole that's recessed, and that'll take the small bolt. It's an Allen headed bolt. The saw comes with an Allen wrench to install that, and that's for the tilt. The front knob to raise the blade, again, has the squared off hole, and it uses this knob. Let's install this first. Installing the blade lift handle is really simple. Just slide on the bushing, then the handle, and then finally the lock knob. Now with the handles installed, I'm going to zero out the blade angle, and then finally I'll raise the blade up just to gauge the center line of the front fence and tighten it down. As you're aligning the fence, make sure that you're aiming for the center line, and you'll see that the kerf is indicated by the large thick line in the center. Now grab a straight edge. For this purpose, even a nice quality level will work good for you. And zero out the mark, sliding it from side to side. And now that I have that aligned, I'm going to go ahead and tighten down the front fence rail. Okay, that's right on. Now that the fence rails are snug down, I want to go through and check them and then just readjust. I'll use a straight edge to make sure that the rails are even from left to right, and I can see that this one's got a little bit of gap there to it, and this will allow me to go through and to level those off. So let me grab my wrench. I'll go through and even those out so they're nice and flat and even with the tabletop. Now with a little bit of adjustment, that rock is gone. And that fence is the same level as the tabletop. Now let's repeat the process on the back rail. This one's got a little more wobble than the front, and there's plenty of adjustment hole size on the back fence rail. I'm going to check the back rail again now, and that's perfect. Maintains the same level as the tabletop, and it's completely flat. This will serve you well for a long time, as your fence is going to ride on the front and rear rail perfectly. Now we can put the fence assembly onto the fence rails and make adjustments. First, let's install the lock handle. That threads right onto the front section of the fence. And once that's in place, just crank it down by hand. And you'll see that it's got a couple of magnets that hold it in the up position so that you can slide it back and forth. The fence will need some adjustment, and it's time well spent going through and adjusting the fence. You'll see that there's a number of adjustments on the fence assembly itself. There are two pads on the inside with set screws on the back side of the T-square, and this will adjust the fence to be square and even with the blade. It also will serve to tighten this up. If you have a lot of slop in your fence, you can run both of these screws in. If you need to tilt it to the left or right, you can push one screw in or one screw out to make sure that it's even, it's parallel with the blade. And the simplest way to do that is to make it parallel with the miter slots. Go through and select one miter slot, line the fence up there, and square it. The other adjustments that you'll see these nylon buttons, and these ride on the face of the fence itself to glide it back and forth. And those are adjustable from the top with an Allen wrench. Finally, in the rear section of the fence, you'll see that there's this foot that goes on the back, and that can be rotated to raise it up or down, and that's going to ride on the rear fence rail. So now that those fences are level, the fence rails are level, this will glide back and forth after those adjustments are made. There's a few adjustments that you're going to want to make on the fence. And typically you're going to lock the fence down to make sure that it's anchored before making the measurement. And then you'll go through and loosen it so you can make the adjustment. In this case, I'm going to square the fence face to the table. So I'll bring it in place over the cast iron, lock it down, take the reading. There's a little bit of adjustment I need to do. So to make that adjustment, I'll loosen it so it's not clamped down. Make a fine adjustment, lock it down, and now it's perfect. Now that the fence is square to the table, we want to make sure that it's square and parallel here with the miter slots and the blade. We'll bring this over to the miter slot, line it up, and as I tighten it down, it'll square itself to the adjustments that are preset. And typically these things are pretty close. You might need to make some fine adjustments. As I'm tightening this down, this is pretty close. I can feel that it needs a little bit of adjustment. And you can do this even with a feeler gauge, or there's some tools that you can purchase that measure it even finer. But you'll take your Allen wrench and insert it into the backside. There's a couple of holes, and that adjusts the tension on these two pads. It pushes them out or lets them in just to square the fence. Now that I've got that one adjusted, I'll bring it through, line it back up, now tighten it down. And that looks really good. I'll go through and actually measure that. I'll just drop a block into the side here and just make sure that it's completely parallel, but it looks great. Now that the fence face is square to the table and we have the face of the fence parallel with the miter slot and the blade, there's one other check I like to do is I'll tighten this down and make sure that it doesn't move back and forth. If it seems like you're having to put too much pressure on the handle, you might have to loosen those two screws on the back evenly, or consequently, if it's loose in the front here and you can slide it back and forth even with the handle down, you loosen this up, take those same two screws and go the exact same number of turns inward or outward to tighten or loosen the clamping force on that front rail. And that'll keep you parallel, but it'll also adjust the clamping force on that rail. The next step to adjusting the fence is to go through and adjust the pointer. We've already got the fence adjusted so that it's parallel, it's square. Now we're going to go through and make sure that it's reading correctly to the blade. And what I'll do, there's a couple of ways to do it. What I'm going to do here is you can go through and rough it in with a tape measure. What I like to do is have a block of wood that I know that is already dimensioned and perfect. I'll set that up against the blade. I'll bring the fence against it. And I know that this is an 8-inch block of wood. So now I'll go through with that pinch between the blade and the fence. I'll loosen the two screws on the window, set this to exactly 8 inches, and now I'll tighten this down. With the hairline readout set precisely, this should come back and read exactly 8 inches every time that I come up with this block of wood. While I still have my flat piece of wood out, I'm going to go through and level off the throat plate. And I can see that it's just a little bit high. I'll take the Allen wrench that's supplied with the machine, give that a turn, and gradually raise it back up till it just touches right there, and I'll go back it off just a little bit. I'll repeat the process on all 4 corners. The next step is to install the switch up onto the fence rail. In order to do that, we're going to have to pull off the end cap. There's 2 Phillips head screws that hold this on. I typically will remove one and loosen one. And this will allow me just to swing it out of the way. Now I can put the switch assembly onto the front rail. Take it out of the bag. Loosen up these 2 bolts by hand here. And this will install onto the fence rail, and it will slide down the front of the fence, and you'll adjust this to your needs, or whatever position you find is comfortable, you'll adjust that, and then finally tighten down these 2 bolts. Simply slide the switch to the position that you're comfortable with. I like to snug it down with my fingers first and then come back in with a 10mm wrench to tighten up these 2 bolts. One. There's the other. Now finally, reinstall the screw in the end cap and tighten them both down. Now we're going to install the overhead guard. You'll see that the saw has a riving knife in the back, and the overhead guard can replace it. Simply unlock the throat plate and lift this off. Make sure that you're doing all this with the machine unplugged, of course. You'll find that there's a quick release handle in the back. Flick that handle to release the riving knife. It slides right out. The overhead guard will drop right in. Be mindful of the spring-loaded paws on the back here. Those are the anti-kickback paws. Drop this in place. Lock that handle, and then slide the throat plate back into place. These 2 black landing pads will be right underneath those 2 anti-kickback paws. Slide it into position and lock this back down. Now that that's ready to go, we can install the dust collection hose onto the overhead saw guard. The first step of the dust collection tube is to install the support bracket that bolts onto the end of the rail. There's a bolt with an Allen head to it, and finally follow that up with the nut and the washer on the back side, and tighten this down. As you tighten it down, just return it to square so it's pointing straight up and down. And finally snug this down. And adjust it as needed. Now the next part is the dust collection tube. There are 2 small hose clamps. We'll fit one of the clamps over the hose, slide it onto the overhead saw guard, and tighten this down. Now that that one is secure, we'll run the hose over the support, lock that in place, and then run this down to the rear dust collection port. Simply slide this over the connector at the rear port. And once that's in position, tighten down the hose clamp. This 4-inch port on the rear will accept a standard 4-inch dust collection hose, and then there's a small hose on the inside that goes up to a guard that surrounds the bottom edge of the blade to collect from the inside. This will collect from the top. Under the side wing of the table, you'll see this tool tray. Here's the wrench to tighten down the blade, and there's slots for some of the other components. Let's install the hook using the 2 screws in the hardware package. And this just screws right in, and you'll find that there's slots here to hang the tools for the machine, the miter gauge, and other accessories. The riving knife has its own storage slot right at the bottom. It'll slide right into here, and there's a small clip that holds it in place. When you use the riving knife, the overhead saw guard will hang back on these 2 hooks here. There's even a convenient spot to store your miter gauge. Finally, you'll see that there's a really nice push stick that comes with the saw, and this helps you to guide your wood through the saw blade. There's a couple of storage locations. One of them is right here on the top, and this is really convenient when you're using the fence and you're making your cut. You can pull it out, push your stock through, and then finally store it back in place. You'll also see that if you're storing your fence, there's another place to store the hook. The fence will store over here on the side, on the fence hooks. And finally, you can store this off to the side, over on one of the side hooks on the machine. Now that your saw is assembled and adjusted, we're ready to plug in the power and test the saw. Let's get my safety glasses on. I'll stand to the side and then push the green button to start. So now we've checked the start button and then our e-stop. This is positioned here with a paddle so that you can push it with your hand or you can hit it with your knee to shut off the saw in case you need to. The Fusion F1 is one of our most popular saws, and we really hope that you found this video informative in answering all the questions that you might have during the setup of your saw. Thank you for choosing Laguna Tools.